In this section, we're going to talk about two ancient modes of interpreting or reading the Bible that were prominent in the ancient world before, say, the 10th century. And those two methods are allegory and midrash. You'll find out later in the course why these are important. So I wanted to talk about them up front. So, first of all, what is allegory or allegorical interpretation of the Bible? So you may be familiar with allegory in other experiences with literature. So a story like Alice in Wonderland or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Maybe those types of stories are allegorical in the sense that they tell a story, but the story is actually about something else entirely, and you have to sort of figure out what that something else, that symbolic meaning is. So, allegory goes all the way back to Plato, essentially, ancient Greek philosopher, and we don't need to get into the details of that, but just so you know, it goes way back. In terms of allegorical interpretation of the Bible, it's at least as old as a guy by the name of Philo of Alexandria, who lived almost at the same time as Jesus, so contemporary of Jesus. And he wrote a huge, thick commentary on the Bible, a good chunk of which is allegorical. So in your reading for this week, I've included just 2 pages of Philo's commentary on Genesis, so you can perhaps just get a taste of what goes on in an allegorical interpretation. The one passage that I want you to look at is actually on the second page of the handout. It's sort of about halfway down the right hand column on the second page, and it's Philo's commentary on Genesis 2, beginning in verse 10. In Genesis, some comments are made about the Garden of Eden, so I'll just read to you what this says. Genesis says, a river flows out of Egypt. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 2 branches. The name of the first is Pishon, and it gives you some details about that. The second is Gihon, and it is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, and the name of the fourth river is Euphrates. So at least a couple of those we're familiar with from history. So Philo's a little mystified why these rivers are being mentioned at all. And so he immediately gives them or suggests that they may have a symbolic meaning. So sort of a hidden symbolic meaning. So hidden meanings are one of the keys behind allegory. So Philo says, and you can read this for yourself, that the river Pishon stands for the virtue of prudence. Gihon stands for the virtue of sobriety, Tigris stands for the virtue of fortitude, and Euphrates stands for the virtue of justice. Now you might ask yourself, where is he getting this? And that's really a good question. But that's sort of the impetus behind allegorical interpretation, and that you take something from the Bible that is seemingly a fairly insignificant or maybe even completely meaningless detail, and you give it meaning by trying to give it a more significant kind of hidden value. So, in essence, allegorical interpretation claims that at least some parts of the biblical text can or must be understood symbolically. Now, we find several examples of Paul in his letters, particularly the first letter of the Corinthians is one that I can think of off the top of my head, where Paul uses a fair amount of allegory. So he talks about the rock that travels along with the Israelites in the desert, and he says that this rock is Christ. So he gives that rock, which is sort of a seemingly insignificant detail of the story, he gives it a huge significance. And he talks about the allegory of Hagar and of Ishmael and Isaac, and he tries to put those stories into an allegorical setting. I believe that's also in 1 Corinthians. So allegory was mostly popular with Christian interpreters. So this is a little ironic since Philo was Jewish, but was part of Alexandria, which was heavily interested in Greek philosophy. So many Christian interpreters use this type of interpretation when talking about the Bible. The other mode of interpretation I'd like to speak about is midrash. And maybe this is a term that you've heard before, but maybe aren't familiar with. And I'd like to provide you some ideas about midrash because this also becomes fairly important later on in the course. So midrash was popular particularly among Jewish interpreters, although it's not limited to Jewish interpreters, but Judaism made midrash popular. So oftentimes you hear that term associated with Jewish modes of interpretation. So midrash focuses on the gaps in or questions about the biblical text. And for this coming week, or during this week, I asked you to read the first several chapters of Genesis because we'll be referring to them in various ways. And included in those chapters is the story of Cain and Abel. Now, you maybe remember the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel begin fighting. Abel is killed, and Cain is expelled from his family and has to go live somewhere else. And then in the next part of the passage, we read that Cain gets a wife and he starts building cities. Now, for modern readers, this is a problem because we wonder, where did Cain's wife come from? And that is not explained in the Bible. It's just left as an open question. So what Midrash does is it tries to explain the things in the Bible that aren't explained. Another aspect of the Cain and Abel story that is interesting, if you go back to the beginning of the story, God accepts the sacrifice of Abel, but rejects the sacrifice of Cain. And we're not really given a clear explanation as to why that is. So this is something that Midrashic interpreters would jump on. They look for things like this in the Bible, things that aren't explained, and they help explain them. So in your reading for this week, I've posted some examples of Midrashic interpretation I'd like for you to take a look at. So they try to explain all sorts of various things. I copied the parts that related to the Cain and Abel story, so you can take a look and see some real life examples of what Midrash looks like. Midrash often requires attention to minute details of the Bible, so sometimes if you're reading Midrash, the interpreters will pick up on things that you never even noticed. And they try to answer questions that people would normally ask about the Bible. So that's one of the things that makes it interesting.